everyone. My name's Michelle Snyder. I'm one of the consultants here at the Center for Healthy Churches. I lead our nonprofit arm, which is called CHC-PneuMatrix, and I'm also the team lead on our organizational development work, which is pretty much helping churches be their best selves in any number of ways, like visioning and strategic planning. Um, we're glad you're joining us for this series that we're calling the Future Ready Church. In this series, we've been taking a deep dive into what it looks like to be a church for the future, where we're tackling some of these strategic questions to help us be our best selves. With me today, I have several of my colleagues, fellow consultants in the Center for Healthy Churches, who are experts in what we're talking about. Interesting that they're experts in thinking about how we help churches not make mistakes in this work that we do. Some of the biggest mistakes that we make, we're going to be talking about that today. And these are folks that have been around a while and have seen churches do things really right and seen churches do things that maybe they would take back and do differently. So today we're going to be asking how we do that work. Today, who I have with me is Matt Cook. He is our fearless leader at the Center for Healthy Churches. Matt has been an installed pastor. How many years were you in Wilmington, Matt? How many years have you
in
been a
Wilmington
pastor,
and
actually?
20 years of being a lead pastor in a congregation.
Okay, Matt has been a lead pastor in churches for 20 years, most recently in Wilmington, North Carolina. But he's also done a number of interims and has worked with dozens of churches at least in this visioning work. So he is a wealth of wit and wisdom. I would say whimsy, except I think I'm the whimsy on the team. I don't know. But glad to have you here, Matt.
You're definitely the whimsy on the team. Whether I'm whimsical is a different question. But
Yeah. We have Reverend Ruth Perkins Lee with us from the Atlanta area of Georgia. Ruth is a pastor in the Cooperative Baptist tradition, but currently is the project director for the ministry collaborative at Princeton Seminary, where she oversees the Lilly-funded project called the Young Adult Initiative. Did I get it, Ruth?
Pretty close. Yep, we'll take it.
Okay. I'm thrilled to have Ruth with us today because she's competent and smart. And she is also someone who I am privileged to call my friend. She is as introverted as I am extroverted, and I will take any opportunity to be in a space where I get a chance to be with Ruth. So welcome, Ruth.
Thank you.
And finally, we have the Reverend Dr. Reginald Wells, who is a pastor at the Falling Run Missionary Baptist Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Reginald has congregational experience, of course, as a pastor in many, many different churches, but also denominational experience, both regionally and at the state. Reginald has written a book called Leading When You Don't Know the Answers. And he spends every day currently in the trenches of pastoral ministry. And so he's got tons of stories about what works and what doesn't. So welcome to everyone as we have this conversation. So the first question I want to ask you is, all of us have worked with churches on visioning, and there's so much energy in the room. We know that thing. You walk in the room, it's palpable. People are excited about what you're going to do, and people leave super motivated to move into the vision. And then we have seen those churches stall out in the work at some point. And I want to talk about what happens that causes churches to stall out. Like, what do you see are some of the mistakes that we make that cause that to happen? Reginald, you're up. I want you to go first.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. I'm excited to be here with my fellow colleagues, Ruth and Matt. One thing that I've discovered, you have these planning sessions, visioning sessions. Everyone leaves fired up, but I've discovered that there are a couple key things I've discovered. Folks really leave the planning session with, there's really no clear plan. They leave, have all these ideas that we've had, stickies around the wall. Visioning is exciting, but without a step-by-step plan, teams don't know what to do next. So we have the visioning. I think often I've seen churches leave, or sessions, retreats, workshops with this plan, but there's really no step-by-step action as to how we're going to go about to do that. So I've seen that happen, and people kind of get stalled out because there was for a weekend, everyone's excited, but then when you start talking about the implementation, you're kind of looking around the room going, so what's next? Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. You can talk about 5 years out. You can talk about the 90 things we're going to do, but nobody exactly knows what the first thing is we're going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Ruth, what have you seen?
I think one of the biggest challenges that happens is that they're not clearly defined champions of the work.
Mhm.
People leave, and there is no one that wakes up thinking about it every day. Um, they have to take on the mantle, and it can be a team of people, but taking on the mantle of, to what Reginald said, okay, what's next? How do we move this forward? How do we get it into the DNA? I mean, I think they're the ones that need to be thinking about short term, medium term, long term. Like what's the next plan? There's a piece in theory of change that reframes short, medium, and long term to learning, action, and conditions. So, what are the transformations we want to see based on that? And so, I think sometimes we lose sight of what we're aiming for, and we don't have really good language. Even if we don't have a good solid plan, but we don't have language. So, because we have learned this, we're going to do this in order to change this. So, I think that kind of language helps people, but if you don't have someone driving that into the DNA, people can lose sight of it amongst everything else that's happening in church.
Hmm. Yeah, it's good. It's good. It strikes me that what you're saying is, yeah, that requires some technical competence. Like you sound very professional in what you're saying. Like
Mhm.
if this, then this for this, and I'm
Mhm.
aware that you do this for a living. It I don't think churches always need expert help,
Mhm.
but that's one example of a place that like
Mhm.
somebody who really knows that stuff could be useful for
Mhm.
a system. Yeah. Matt.
So for me, one of the times that I see churches lose traction most readily is when they borrowed the vision from outside their own DNA.
Mm.
Um, it so you get an aging congregation that's like, hey, we're going to reach young families, and that's a noble goal, and that's a goal that excites a lot of churches, and yet they don't, and then they think strategically, this is what you've got to do to make that happen. It's a new worship service. It's hiring a youth minister. There are some tried and true, or what have been some tried and true tactics that would help them get from A to B. But if so we planted some things in our backyard recently, and we spent a lot of time looking to try to figure out. We planted a tree in the corner of our property. What kind of tree is going to grow well in the shade? Because there's two other big trees in our backyard. A lot of congregations don't ask the question, can this kind of dream emerge out of the soil, out of who we are at this moment in time? And so they borrow it from someone else, and then all of a sudden they're surprised. Why isn't this taking off? And it's just they don't have the prerequisite conditions within their makeup at that moment for it to emerge. So I I really work hard when I do visioning work, strategic work with congregations, to make sure that you're drawing on the things that you have some strength and you have some resonance with as you think about what kind of dream your congregation needs to dream.
Yeah, I think that's I
Yeah.
think that's spot on. One of our earlier episodes, someone said that when we get started, what we need to do is ask, who do we have and where is our energy, as the kind of two foundational questions. Um, and I can hear when you don't do that. There can be a lot of energy about how we get a lot of young kids, but
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Reginald, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, as Matt was talking, excuse me, it's really about being intentional about bridging the gap between dreaming and doing. You
Hmm.
know, we dream, we have these sessions, but we have to. I think a lot of churches fail to bridge that gap between dreaming, having these big dreams, as he stated, about attracting youth, younger families. That's dreaming, but how do we do that? A vision without execution is really it's just inspiration.
Hmm.
you know
Hmm.
you have to have some execution as to how do you go from having this dream to doing. So I think a lot of times I've seen churches have big dreams, but no one really thinks about how we're going to do that. Yeah. Matt, that was a perfect example about the tree. What kind of tree will grow among those shaded trees?
Yeah, and I think a tree will grow, right? Like you there that I think churches can reach young people, but are you doing it in ways that kind of grows up out of you, what your strengths are, what your abundance is? You
Right.
know, there's that old Beekner line about calling is the place where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger overlap. And I've taken out the word gladness, which I think is a good word, and just talk about abundance. Like, what's the abundance of your congregation,
Mhm.
and where does that overlap the need, and then plant there. So
Yeah. There's a saying, I'll probably get it wrong, but it's like a a goal without a plan is just a wish. Yeah,
yep.
that's what I yeah. Yeah, so sticking with Matt, what do you think are some of the biggest elephants in the room that can get in the way for us or sabotage our efforts at visioning?
So a lot of times congregations will unintentionally underestimate the need for sacrifice and change in the midst of a visioning process. So uh, more than once I've seen a church think, okay, we're gonna have this strategic planning process, we're gonna have this visioning process, we're gonna come up with this thing, and what they think they're gonna do is it's just gonna come into being on top of everything they're already doing. And so it represents change, but it doesn't represent sacrifice. It doesn't represent actually having to do the kind of the hard work of prioritizing, of deciding what does our best energy need to go into. It doesn't ask the questions, are there some ways that we go about operating as a congregation that are they themselves in the way of what we're trying to accomplish? So I never try to talk a church into giving up what is like what they deeply value in order to make something new happen. But there are ways that you can hold on to the values but practice that different. But that's still a sacrifice question. So that's one of the places. And then the other
Matt, before
thing,
you move on, can I just
yeah,
ask you something
sure.
there? Because one school of thought, I've heard a school of thought or like lived in spaces where they say, if you take on that sacred cow, you're gonna lose, and it's gonna become a point of conflict. And so what we should do is bless and add. So maybe don't put a lot of energy into the strawberry festival, but don't try to take on the strawberry festival. And I hold that truth, and I think that's sometimes wise with what you're saying, which is we got to sacrifice, and we've got to name that we've got to sacrifice, and we've got to be willing to give some things up for the vision. Like, how do you hold those two hands together or reconcile that?
So I do think it's possible for congregations to perform experiments, right? And to bring something into being that doesn't require the whole system to adapt around the experiment that is coming into being. And I honestly I wish more congregations would approach that from that mode. Having said that, that's more of an initiative being born from above than it is something like a strategic planning process in which we are kind of orienting the whole system around these larger goals that need to occupy some of the best energy of the congregation. So part of it is just a question of size and scope. If your congregation is really thinking about how do we set our course for the next 10 years, well, that's a big set of questions and a big set of, a big vision almost always has to require a corresponding amount of sacrifice and change to make it work. On the other hand, if you're creating one new thing, that's different. You can have and the corresponding amount of sacrifice and change can be scaled to fit. So that's how I think about it.
So it's easier to bless the small adult Sunday school class that has 6 people in it while we experiment with adding new things. That's a bless and add kind of model, as opposed to 40 people get in a room and are trying to chart a course. We
Yeah.
got to be willing to hold some stuff up and say, we got to be willing to let it go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If your
I hear that.
church is I suspect all of us have been in strategic planning processes when churches are in numerical decline and they're trying to figure out what do we do to reverse that decline? What do we do to chart a new course? And it feels like a moment of peril, right? It feels like a threshold moment. And what I'm saying is, at a threshold moment,
Yeah, yep.
this is not just a probably not just a bless and add. So
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay. Reginald, elephants in the room. What are some of the biggest elephants in the room that block our view, that we can't see around?
Unresolved leadership conflict.
Mm,
Um, you know, if there's mistrust among key stakeholders, staff and laypersons, you know, it quietly undercuts what you're trying to do, the unity and the follow through.
Yeah.
You know, so I think I've seen where there have been some situations where, you know, there was some unresolved leadership conflict. No one really talked about it. It kind of alluded to it, you know, and then when you started to implement the vision, there was so much distrust among the staff, the laity, even the congregation. There was really it kind of undercut what you're trying to do. So, you know, people smile in the room, but they resist behind the scenes of what's really going on. Everybody's nodding at the table in agreement, but, you know, they have the parking lot meeting where they're saying, you know, we need to deal with this. There's no one talked about this, or they kind of quietly talk about it, allude to it, or make some references. I had a recent experience where there was a pastor in the midst of a congregation transition, and everyone kind of knew that he kind of avoided conflict, but no one said it. But now that he's gone, everyone's kind of talking about it, and it's kind of caused me not to move forward in what they're wanting me to do.
Mm-hmm. What I mean, if there are pastors watching this who are in that situation, like trying to lead a process and that's happening, what do you do about that? How does
We have to name it? You know, we have to name those things. They're painful. You know, no, we don't like to talk about painful things. Sometimes we try to act as if they're not there or did not happen. I think you have to name it. If not, the current pastor will not be able to implement the vision because there's so much mistrust and from previous leadership or conflicts with leaders in the church. So you have to name it. Yeah.
I think Reginald is 100% right. Like I've seen more than one church do a strategic planning process because the pastor was unhappy and was trying to make the church into something he wanted it to be. And it's usually a he that does that. I won't say
Of
that
course
she's
it
very
is.
capable, but I see more he's do it than she's do that. And yet it doesn't fit who the congregation is. It doesn't fit their values. And so the whole church goes through this process and has all these discussions. It doesn't resolve the underlying issues. And then the pastor leaves 6 months later or a year later. And then there's the strategic plan sitting there as the result because the pastor was trying to force it on the congregation. And the congregation is like confused about what do we do with all of this next. So, yeah.
And I would
becomes
say not even when the pastor leaves. I mean, passive aggression is alive and well in the church where,
right.
you know, people are assigned stuff and then they just don't do it.
Yeah.
And it becomes one of those situations where the congregation says that was his or that was hers. You know, this is not ours. We really never signed on to this. You know, this is what they wanted to do. It was never something we wanted to do. So I think the unresolved leadership conflict will prohibit the vision from being implemented and going forward.
Yeah. Ruth.
Yeah, I have two, both around leadership, but kind of on the other end of the spectrum, more in the healthy frame, unintentional frame. Sometimes I think leadership can get too far ahead of the congregation, unintentionally. Sometimes I know, and maybe y'all have experienced that the leadership team is doing the really good, hard, head down stuff without bringing the congregation along. And some of it for the leadership team, it's intuitive. So they don't think about giving it language in order to get to the congregation. So then I think both end up with assumptions and then they're surprised when they're not the same. So very well meaning, very well intentioned, just missed the conversation pieces that needed to happen all along the way to bring the congregation along. I think the second one is also a leadership struggle, maybe not just with staff, but in the congregation themselves. I'm a firm believer that the same people around the same table working on the same problem is not going to come to a different answer. They're going to stay in that same lane. And so creativity typically comes from the outside. You don't have to blow the whole thing up, but you do need an outside voice. And so maybe it's somebody that's just new to a leadership role or somebody that's new in the congregation. It could be that you include a community person or a partner organization person, somebody that can challenge and encourage and help the process along.
Yeah, I think that's a good and challenging word. It is true. You know, this visioning work starts with a foundational assumption, which is that we're capable of thinking differently about the system we've helped create. And I think in some ways it is. In some ways, it absolutely is the case that we can sit down and discern faithfully, dream big dreams together, take risks, um, have new eyes. I also think that culture is ubiquitous and hard to see our way out of. Yeah, that's
I want
So
to
And
also,
again,
go ahead.
go ahead,
so
go ahead.
everyone has an opinion.
Okay.
Reginald, and then Matt, and then Ruth.
No, Ruth, I defer.
Okay, Ruth.
I was just going to say, there are ways to dream big with the same people, but if we really want to do a shift, a major shift, then sometimes I think we just can't see beyond ourselves. And oftentimes the outside world is really encouraging, that can help us realize where we need to stay the course. Like, where do we need to keep working, that we are doing good, uh, and representing the church well and sharing the love of God. And they can also say, okay, but this over here that matters a whole lot to y'all actually doesn't matter to anybody else. You can keep doing it. You just need to know that the rest of us aren't seeing what you're seeing with it.
Hmm.
And I want to just add something similar to what Ruth just stated. You know, longtime members, influential voices, fear losing their power. You know, fear losing their place or their traditions. You know, it's a fear of change. So they kind of stall the momentum. It's sort of like passive resistance through. You know, they know it needs to change. They hear these voices, but if I hear this voice from another younger leader, there's a possibility I'm going to lose my influence. I'm going to lose my traditions. I'm going to lose my power. And so it sort of becomes a passive resistance. Just, you know, fear of change can stall a process. Yeah.
Yeah. If you listen to me talk long enough, you'll hear me quote Friedman that people don't resist change, they resist loss. And
Yeah.
I think, yeah,
That-
it is an elephant in the room. Everybody is supposed to be excited about visioning, and I'm sitting here afraid of what I'm going to lose. And that's
Right.
real. And it gets unnamed, goes unnamed. Yeah.
Right.
Matt, what were you gonna say?
Well, to Ruth's first point, and it's we've kind of set up some two things that we want to hold in tension. At least that's the way I'm hearing, and I think we should hold both of them in tension. A new voice, right? New energy, outsider perspective. At the same time, when Ruth was talking about, you know, the disconnect that it can often happen, leadership can get out in front. I can't tell you how many times, if you're watching this and you're contemplating a strategic planning process or a visioning process, the temptation in that moment is, let's get the 9 people that are most enthusiastic about this new idea and let's let them do the work. And that creates the dynamic that Ruth was talking about in her first point. It's not that it's bad to have them. That goes to Ruth's second point. But you've got to do the work of connecting that enthusiasm and that passion and that perspective into the larger system. I'm a believer that you do that well by making sure that the visioning team includes both influential versions of both people in it. Leadership selection is a crucial aspect of vision development. So, whatever that's worth.
So I think you've actually moved into my next question, which is, what are some of the best practices of sort of staying out of these ditches in terms of implementation? And I wonder if you could say more about that, about leadership selection in that way.
So, and that's both in the so you think about it as vision, the dreaming process and the implementation process. What I was talking about primarily was the dreaming stage, right? Like getting the people who are going to dream the dream into being, the brainstormers, the visionaries that are peeking around the corner and seeing what might emerge. I think you do it there. And then then leadership selection, when it comes to the implementation phase, it's a different calculation. So a lot of times we recommend to churches have one team that brings something into being and bring a couple of those folks on, but then bring a different team in whose skill set is the things that Ruth was talking about earlier, about how do we actually translate that into action steps. How do we go in the way that Reginald was talking about, from dreaming into actually doing? What's step 1? What's step 2? Who are people that are good at the step 1, 2, and 3, and kind of keeping the ball rolling down the field. So that's part of it in leadership selection. The other thing that I think is really, really important, at least in the congregations that I've worked with, is don't assume that because you dream something into being that you're just going to go start, you're going to get busy creating it day one. I think there's a learning phase to the implementation work that is absolutely crucial. Your system, this is a organizational behavior maxim. I didn't come up with it. Your system is perfectly calibrated to create the results that it is currently creating. And in essence, you're trying to create new results, which means you have to recalibrate your system. And the recalibration process almost certainly is going to happen through learning. You're going to have to be taught some things that you don't know how to do. And so, but the cool thing about a learning phase is it really can create great energy. Like when people go and experience and learn from people that are a few steps ahead, they come back and go, wow, like there was this church that was doing this. There was this nonprofit that was doing this. We learned so much about how we could make this possible. And we've actually seen it. We've seen it work. So it's not just a dream. There's a tangible version of it out there in the world. So that's another thing that I would that's a best practice that I would draw every church back to.
So when I think about the leadership thing, what I say to groups oftentimes, so maybe around transition teams, or I think in this case, dreaming teams, is I think every person in the church should be able to see themselves on the team. So if I'm a long timer, I should be able to see myself on the team. If I'm a new person, I should be able to see myself on the team. Male and female, young and old, long tenured, short tenured. So when you were talking about leadership teams, that's what I was thinking about. Like getting buy-in from the collective oftentimes requires that I believe that I have been represented in some way. So yeah, anyway, for what that's worth. Best practices, Ruth.
So my story is kind of the next steps, Matt, of what you're talking about in terms of picking leadership. I had a fantastic conversation with the pastor one time whose church visioning, very small church, whose church visioning led them to operating a food truck. It was kind of a wild journey. And I would be interested if any of y'all have the same experience. But she was recapping what happened. And one of the stories that stayed with me was just about their leadership team and deciding who was on that. And one of the things that they were looking at were passions. Who's passionate about this project? And there was a church member who was very passionate, but his wife came to the pastor and said, don't put him on that. Like, he's passionate about this whole thing. That's not where he needs to be. Don't put him in the truck. Don't put him there. So they begin to look at, we've got this person who's really passionate, but might not be a good fit in these ways. So out of his passion, what can he do? And so they paid attention to what he was in the church. Like, who was he in the church? And he was the guy that everybody loved. He talked to everybody, made sure they felt welcome. So he became the person that worked the line at the food truck. So if you've ever been in a food truck, you know it takes a hot minute to get all the way up to the truck itself. And so wildly successful move, because you have this guy who is so happy to be there and is just making people feel welcome. So I think a couple of things about that. I think you absolutely need to pick good leadership, but in the actual carrying out, we also got to pick really good people in the carrying out of it. And so we have to pay attention to who we're seeing in our churches, what their gifts and skill sets are. And it's not lost on me that his wife is the one that said, nope, don't do that. So hearing well what somebody else is thinking about doing. So it has caused me to step back and think, yes, there's absolutely a need for leadership and quality leadership and a really good idea around how to pick it. And what do we do with the people that are really passionate, maybe more passionate than anybody else, that shouldn't be on the team?
I had something, I have a personal story, something similar to that. During COVID, we started food giveaway weekly that we still continue now. And I implemented it. Well, I had the vision for it, pull the team together. So I started showing up weekly to hand out food. And the person who was the leader of the team said to me, pulled me aside and says, hey, we really appreciate you being here. but you're really bogging down the process. You're talking to everyone.
I love this story.
You're just all in the way. You're in the way. Says that. So what we don't want you to interact with the people at the cars. We just want you to kind of stand back, take pictures, because you're slowing our process down. I learned from that as a pastor, as a leader, you can vision, but you may not be the person to do the hands-on, or because you can get. They were saying to me in a nice way, buddy, you need to move out of the way. You're messing up. And I would go in to pack, and they had a system. I thought that I was just putting stuff everywhere, and I was like, nah, you just probably need to show up when it's time to take pictures.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, we're saying a lot of different versions of we need to have the right people on the bus in the right seats.
I was not the right person to be in the right seat.
Yeah. So I don't think that was your answer to my question. Let me ask it of you, Reginald. What are some best practices? You said where it gets lost is from dreaming to doing. And I wanted to ask you then, I held it until now. How do you do that? What,
other than keeping pastors out of all of the implementation? Other than that.
Right.
Well, you have to appoint a vision implementation team. I think that is very key. You have all the, you vision, you have the, but you leave the meeting again frustrated because no one has been assigned. So put together a team, and then break it. Another thing I've discovered, break the vision into strategic priorities. What's important? What's the most important thing? Because COVID, we had a strategic plan in our church, and when COVID hit, what we thought was priority was not priority. It was meeting the needs of the people. It was not necessarily building a new facility or housing. It was at that very moment. It was, hey, folks need food, they need vaccinations or what have you. So I think you have to prioritize and be able to pivot. To pivot. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my answer. Nobody asked me, but I'm gonna answer the question too anyway. I think revisiting and revisiting and revisiting what we've done and how'd it go and what did we learn. I think there's some technical cycle of that. Like you do it and then you, Ruth, do you know this? Like
I can't think of the language. Yep,
me neither. But
the circle.
Yeah, you do the work and then you pull out the learnings and you see what's worked, you see what hasn't, you go back to the drawing board and you try again. And I find that I find that churches get stuck around their first point of stuckness and then don't know how to push through it. They don't know how to name it as learning. They don't know how to name it as experimentation. So they're trucking along and they're doing great and they've done step 1 and they've done step 2 and then they hit a roadblock at step 3 and then they're like, guess that didn't work, and then we're done. And so building in processes where we name learning, we name failure as learning, and we give the system a chance to recalibrate, be nimble and flexible around the needs on the ground in real time.
I think that failure is learning is key. So if you're watching this and you're in the middle of a process, like Michelle's 100% correct.
You can't say that enough, Matt. Yeah, you can't say that Michelle's 100% correct.
Michelle's 100%, maybe 99% correct. I don't want to give her 100%, but Michelle's 100% correct. Churches are bad about not wanting to fail. And if we do, we stop. So absolutely expect to fail. We do that in every other endeavor in life. Everything we do that's worthwhile, we fail to get better. So.
Yeah, that idea of failing forward. So often we think of failing as a setback. Or it has stopped us. But how do you use the momentum of fail to keep going forward?
It's a really effective, in some places where I have seen this done really effectively, we've revisited every 6 months. And every 6 months we ask the same 3 questions. What do we need to celebrate that has gone extraordinarily well and we've succeeded at? The sort of green, yellow, red. What have we succeeded at that has gone crazy well? What is stuck that we need to rethink a bit because it's sort of in the yellow zone? And what was a miserable failure that we need to name as a good learning and release from our plan so that it doesn't sort of bog us down? And if we do that every 6 months, we keep from getting stuck in that way.
So it's
I
not
find
like
that
you're
to be
talking
a
about
really.
building rhythms. You really talk about building rhythms. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, we begin again. And in some ways it's, on one hand, we've got a plan. We're committed to the plan. We're going to stick to the plan. The plan is the plan. And we're not rethinking it every 6 months. And also, we're nimble in our implementation of the plan. Yeah. Yeah. Matt, are you leaning in like you want to say something?
No, I was reviewing some of the things that we had kind of processed earlier that I was trying to decide, but no, we're good. Honestly, it's been a great conversation.
Okay. All right. And I think at that, we're probably at time. So let me thank our panelists for the good conversation, the good hearty conversation. And thank you if you are listening to us today. We're really grateful for the opportunity to think with you about these things that take up your days and lives and mental space and bandwidth. They take ours up too, as we work to help churches be the most effective representation of God's kingdom come in the world. We hope that you've heard some advice and insights that you found helpful. We love when folks call us and ask us to journey with them on these paths around visioning and strategic planning. We've got some people, as you can see on this panel, we've got some people who are really good at what they do with a lot of expertise and deep wells of wisdom and insight. So if we can ever be of assistance to you in your long-range planning or visioning, please reach out to us at our website at churches.org. Thanks and have a great day.